Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. I'm your host, Detective Trogdor, and before we get into our topic today, I would like to show off some fan mail today. I got this beautiful painting from a lovely young fan of mine. She calls it Pooey. She painted it herself, and it was painted by my daughter. So this is the level of art that we're dealing with so far. But if you would like to have your art, shown here, you can submit yours. Let's just put that right. Put that right there. That's a good spot. All right, so today's topic, if you couldn't tell by the title of the video or what is presented on my shirt today, we are going to be talking about Centralia, Pennsylvania. It is probably one of the more unfortunate and sad stories. When I was doing my research initially, I came with the mentality that this was kind of a comical subject in a sense, where like, ha ha ha, this happened, like kind of laughing at others' misfortune in a sense, but like, because it's like, you could have done something, like, you stupid idiots, kind of laugh at the misfortune, when it actually turns out, the more I did my research on it, it's actually a much sadder story. By no means, because there are still people that have been affected by this natural disaster that occurred in Centralia that are still alive today. So it's definitely not something to be laughing about, because they are still feeling the effects of what happened. As well as, like I said, this is, the more I learned, the more it actually made it actually feel a little more personal. And hopefully this helped bring to light, because, like I said, a lot of people, I came in with the mentality that this was something laughable in a sense, but it is still a very unfortunate and sad situation that happened. For the basics, just to get you a brief summary of where we're going in, just so you can understand. Centralia is the 113th largest city in Pennsylvania. Sorry. Centralia is currently the 1,013th largest city in Pennsylvania, and it is 19,443rd in the U.S. So there's some statistics brought to you by the Census Bureau. It is also the 6th most visited attraction in Pennsylvania to this day. So why is Centralia significant with regards to the rest of the state, the rest of the United States? So Centralia was a mining city. So back in the mid to late 1800s, coal was a big source of fuel and energy for steel productions, for trains, what have you. So coming into, mining in the United States, it was an untapped market, because to that point, no huge mining had occurred, much like in, Europe and the Eastern world. But in Pennsylvania, in Centralia specifically, there is a type of coal called anthracite. I'm saying that wrong. Anthracite. Anthracite coal is a much older form of coal. Buster, stop snoring. It was formed 3 million years ago in the hills, in the mountains in Appalachia. 75% of the world's anthracite is found in the United States, and 90% of that anthracite is found in the Centralia region of Pennsylvania. So it is a big gold mine to be had there, and why this town was such a big deal at it, and when it was up and coming. Why anthracite is much more important than regular coal or bitmus coal is that anthracite burns hotter, it burns longer, and it releases a lot more energy when it is being utilized. So it's much more efficient to be using anthracite than to be using just regular old coal, because you get more bang for your buck. So let's take it back to before Centralia was a booming city per se. So back in 1749, the Native Americans that had lived in the region, they sold their land to the Europeans for about 500 pounds. If you were to translate that into today's money, it's about $124,000. In 1770, the settlers started arriving and started building the Reading Road. So Reading Road was forming Reading, Pennsylvania, all the way out to Fort Augusta, which is located in, I'll do my post-production research, and we'll just put the name of the town right here. So wherever Fort Augusta is currently, they took it from, from Reading, Pennsylvania, Reading, Pennsylvania, all the way to Fort Augusta. And it was pretty significant because, as we're moving west, we need to have much safer routes for both animal attacks and just ease of travel to be moving out there. Route 61, which will come in later, largely follows the historic road that formed from Reading, Pennsylvania, all the way out to Fort Augusta. In 1793, Robert Morris acquired the land that would one day become Centralia. Robert Morris was a Revolutionary War hero. He was one of the people that actually signed the Declaration of Independence. However, he went bankrupt after the war, and he was sent to debtor's prison in 1798. So now the land, the government has, repossessed it, and they sold it at auction. In 1830, Stephen Girard, he was a former French sea captain, purchased the land at auction in Philadelphia for $30,000. $30,000 in, we're talking, 1830s money. So today would be $910,000. This is back before they actually truly knew the value of the land and the mineral rights underneath. Otherwise, it would never have sold for the prices that it was going for. In 1832, the town was named Bull's Head after the tavern that was built in town. And the tavern was built because they were starting to build a train because they had discovered that there was ore underneath the grounds there. So they started to have a more efficient way of moving coal from the mountain out to the big cities. So they needed to have a place for these people to start setting up and essentially start forming your little community. So Bull's Head Tavern was the first place. So they named it after it. In 1854, large-scale mining had begun after the construction of the Mine Run Railroad. Now it was easy to move all this anthracite out of the region and into the cities. So mining just started picking up. In 1866, Alexander Ray formed and named the town Centerville. Now, Centerville was already the name of a legit town in Schuylkill County, Pennsylvania. So they decided to change it to Centralia because they wanted to be the center of all things going on. And their current population at that time was 1,300 people. Unfortunately, on October 17th, 1868, Alexander Ray was murdered by the Molly Maguires. The Molly Maguires were a gang of Irish Americans that were specifically targeting white Anglo-American business owners, mainly coal mine operators, tenement houses, landlords, people that preyed on disenfranchised people of that time. So, the Irish specifically were what you describe as disenfranchised because they came over here from Ireland and they were discriminated against strictly because they were Irish, but because they were Roman Catholics, and they always give them the worst job. So it's kind of like you kicking them and then keeping them down the entire time. So naturally, when you get that kind of beating, you want to rise up against the powers that be, the people that put you there. So they started targeting landlords and all the other bigwigs. They took the phrase, let's kill the landlord, and they took it to the extreme. They actually went out and were murdering people that they did not believe were right. There's actually a local legend that the whole reason that the Centralia mine fire occurred was because the pastor of the Catholic Church in the area called condemnation on the Molly Maguires and told them pretty much to fess up who was it that murdered Alexander Ray, and no one spoke up about it. So, because everyone was keeping their mouth shut and they weren't owning up to the murder that occurred, I can't really speak on what kind of business practice Alexander Ray had, but I can imagine that if the church is trying to quell this, he wasn't that terrible of a person. Since no one had actually fessed up and owned up to who actually murdered Alexander Ray, the pastor put a curse per se on the town, saying, this church will be the only thing left standing. This town will burn to the ground. Ironically enough, that church actually was condemned and knocked down during getting ahead of myself. We'll get to that part at the end. The population of Centralia peaked in 1890 with 2,800 people. In 1970, though, U.S. work production was slowing down as we were going into World War I. As our workers went out, to go fight, less people are there to start coal mining and moving the coal. So it just kept going. And then after the war came back, interest began to decline because work conditions were terrible. You just went over to fight a war and you wanted to come back and go into, in some situations, even more risky, more life-threatening situations than they were probably facing out in the war. As the nation was moving away from World War I and moving towards World War II, more and newer forms of energy production were being formed, so there was less reliance on coal. You had natural gas forming up, you had probably something else. So people started not wanting to use coal because it was dangerous to mine and it was filthy. But then in 1929, the stock market crashed. So Lehigh Valley Coal Company, which had owned about 5 mines in the area, closed them all down. At this point, because it was the Great Depression and people had to get by, so one thing they needed for their houses would be coal to burn to keep their house warm. So people started doing what's called bootleg mining, which is they would go into abandoned mines and they would start chiseling away at these pillars that were supporting the top of the caves. The problem with that is that those pillars weren't left there by accident. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to come get that later. Those pillars were supporting the roofs of the cave, so these people would start chopping away and taking this anthracite out of there. The supports would be gone, and the whole thing would collapse on itself. So you'd have collapsed tunnels. In 1941, coal production picked up shortly, and then World War II came around. So we, knocked down production once again. In 1950, the city council acquired the mineral rights to what the land that was underneath because of all these companies going bankrupt, and they were really hoping that by owning those mineral rights, they could then turn around and turn a production and turn a profit on all this coal that was sitting underneath of them that other people weren't able to get to, but now they owned it all. In 1950, the population was reduced to 2,000 people. So we're talking in 60 years, 800 people have moved out of the town. Now, that's not that dramatic of a loss, but it is beginning to show the decline of the population in this area. So now we are currently at the point where the story turns sour. May 27th, 1962. The population currently was at 1,400 people, so now we just lost another 600 people in the course of 12 years. So it's really not, as you can see, this big booming town has slowly been declining. There are many theories about what had happened on this day, but the general consensus, and we'll get into a lot of the other theories later, but the main consensus theory is that in preparations for Memorial Day weekend, the town wanted all the trash that was left in their landfill to be burned off so that the smell would be gone and that they would be able to enjoy their celebrations in peace, because this is a town of a lot of veterans, because like I said, these people would go out to fight the war and they would come right back and start mining right away. So their landfills were primarily just open mine pits in the ground. So what would happen is instead of digging in caves and digging down to the ground, they would just open up the land and then chip away at the coal. But when all these different coal mines went out of business, they had these giant open holes in the ground. So what should they do? They just pour the trash in there. Now, don't think that these people are just all of a sudden found a hole in the ground and start pouring trash in there. They made sure to go down and plug up all the holes that would go down to mine shafts that would lead to ore veins, and they would make sure they were all covered up. Unfortunately, that was not the case entirely. So at the landfill near the Oddfellows Cemetery was lit on fire to burn off all the trash, and they would sit there. The fire department would be there to burn it off, be a controlled burn. They could toke it and then get all this stuff to burn out so the smell would be gone. They sprayed it down. They thought everything was good. Then come the next day, they still start smelling the smoke. They notice something's wrong. They go up and they investigate, and the trash pit is still smoking, it's still smoldering, which now is a big issue, because if this fire department had doused the whole thing with water and had supposedly put it out, this fire should not have reignited itself, because everything underneath would have suffocated itself had it just been trash burning. Almost immediately, the town knew that something was wrong. The firefighters got right back on the scene and started trying to put it out as best they could. Unfortunately, as you'll find, it was doomed from the start. There was almost no ability to actually completely extinguish this thing. So let's say on day one, they started putting out the fire, and the surface fire would be extinguished. They'd pour extra water on just to be safe. Next day, fire would pop up again. It might be somewhere else in town too, because we're talking about tunnels that are going underneath the city. A contractor initially came in. This isn't a founded statement, but it's a lot of hearsay from people in the town. Is that a contractor had come in, said that I can put out your fire for you, but you have to give me the mineral rights to your entire city, which to them was egregious, because we're not talking like hundreds and thousands or maybe millions. We're talking billions of dollars worth of coal that is underneath there, anthracite more importantly. So there's no way they were about to just give it up just so they could put this fire out. But like I said, this statement is kind of unfounded. I can't really find any sources specifically that state that contractor, whoever they are, actually came up with that proposal. Every time that the town would put funds together, or they would reach out to the state to put funds together to help extinguish this fire, pour more water on it, do investigation and whatnot, money would run out pretty much right before the fire was put out completely. And this is going to be a recurring trend as it goes on. This constantly running out of money right before it puts so much doubt in government ability to handle this situation, which will become a problem later. In June of 1962, funds were made available by the state of Pennsylvania to help agitate the trash pile and keep the heat wet to keep it down. So if they were hoping to just keep stirring it and get water further down, they might be able to put out the fire completely. But this was a short-term success, and the fire just kept raging on. The fire had spread now beyond the internal site at this point. It wasn't just located to this small caves and small, iron, I keep saying iron, or coal veins right beneath the trash pit. Now it's starting to spread throughout the region. In November of 1962, drilling was commenced all over the town to locate how far this fire had spread at this point. When this started happening, the veteran miners from the area told them that if they dug down any farther, that they were pretty much just going to be feeding this fire more oxygen, and they weren't going to be putting out. And exploratory drilling was essentially just making the fire worse. By spring of 1963, emergency funds had run out. Like I just said prior, all this money, all these goodwills had just started running out right before the fire would be put out. Later that spring, a plan had been formed to, instead of dumping more water, exploratory drilling, they decided to start digging a trench between where the existing fire was and the town to try to smother it, just cut it off, to stop it from actually being able to do anything. In the summer of 1963, trench project had gone underway. Unfortunately, though, the fire, when they were digging, they had discovered the fire had already gone beyond their proposed line where the trench should have been dug. So the trench was all for naught. In 1967, more exploratory drilling was occurring yet again, and they had learned that the fire was now down 225 feet beneath the surface. So this wasn't just a localized issue. This was now pretty much the entire mountain was becoming affected by this rampant fire. A revised plan was put in place. Instead of just dumping water, which would go down and then flush out, they decided to start pouring crushed stone in there, and then they would pour water on, so the crushed stone could act as a sort of ground barrier. But at the same time, this plan didn't work. So at this point, the people of the town, as they've seen attempt to put out this fire, had failed so many times. Now they're starting to get super concerned. At this point, they're starting to push the borough to start reaching beyond the state and start going federally. They started to pressure the U.S. Bureau of Mines to help them find a solution to put this out. They suggested the use of this stone and water barrier again, but they were also going to be used what's called fly ash barrier, which fly ash is a byproduct of industrial coal burning. So it's pretty much just coal ash, so it's non-combustible, mixed in with the water, and they pour it down and hopefully just extinguish it and then leave this film essentially everywhere so nothing could catch on fire. Unfortunately, the issue is that they're on a mountain and that all these mines run downhill, so the water would just pour down and pour out of different little crevices and here and there, so it wouldn't actually be effective in putting out the fire. Fly ash was also found to be extremely toxic, so that didn't really help the environment whatsoever. So it's another one of those situations where they're just poisoning the soil. In 1969, the residents of Centralia had started to directly feel the effects of the fire itself. What you doing, buddy? You got a scratch? William and Janet Burster were some of the first people to start getting recorded effects of the fire. Besides them noticing smoke and steam coming out of the ground, they started suffering from headaches and nausea, as did their neighbor, Mason Laughlin. So the borough decided to start digging trenches between their house and the supposed fire, just to make sure that it wasn't going to go underneath them, because with fire comes different kinds of gases that are being released, carbon monoxide being one of the biggest culprits. In 1974, the fly ash barrier was complete, but it had failed, like I discussed before, as early as 1972, as the fire had already pushed beyond it and it just kept running out of the mountain. The Bureau of Mines, however, dug their heels in and said that that barrier would work. However, the evidence proved otherwise. I don't know why they were in denial about that. In 1977, they finally recognized that this mine fire imposed a bigger issue than they were anticipating. In 1978, they started shoring up all the boreholes. They started pouring water down them, doing whatever they could to help, just anything and everything they could to possibly put out this fire. More trenches were starting to be dug as well, which was in a lot of people's yards. A lot of people were not happy with it because, yet again, now we're starting to feel the effects, not necessarily the physiological effects, but now the psychological effects of these people, where their homes are now essentially being destroyed. In 1980, carbon monoxide poisoning was becoming rampant across the town, as sinkholes started showing up everywhere. It's referred to as subsidence, whereas the earth just collapses in on itself. In 1980, the total estimated widespread area of the fire was 150 acres. Tunnel collapse was a frequent occurrence, which is where that subsidence came in, because the only supports for these tunnels were the aforementioned coal pillars that supported the whole thing, or just the coal around the walls of it in general, or the timber supports that kept up all the mines. So as soon as they were gone, the weight of the earth above it, on top of the heat and gases trying to escape out, would cause it to collapse in left and right. Some people wanted their homes bought out so that they could relocate, while other people were kind of in denial about the severity of the issue, so they remained in place. So some people were issued carbon monoxide alarms, the people that are directly affected, the ones closest to the fire. However, it was recommended that everyone in town have one. Those that couldn't afford them were sharing them with their neighbors, which was just not a good idea in general, because if you take it out of your house, now your house is prone, because carbon monoxide doesn't just slowly creep in, it can happen all at once. So you could also then take that alarm and put it in your house, and it would go off at the instant it was put in there, because it's already, your house is flooded with carbon monoxide, and many times people just ignored it. They didn't really know what else they could do. Where would they go? To their neighbor's house that was flooded with carbon monoxide? Other people would just start keeping canaries, because that was cheaper than having a carbon monoxide alarm that had to constantly be checked and recalibrated. If the canary dies, then you probably should get out. In 1981, the fire had finally breached the surface, and we're no longer talking just gases and smoke and everything. Fire had actually started leaping from the ground, and temps at that point had reached in excess of 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit, or 650 degrees Celsius. Before we go any further, I'd like to state that nobody died as a result of this fire or anything, so there's no reason to worry, but there were some situations that were pretty iffy. The first one being, and this is where, besides the carbon monoxide affecting people's health, this was where national attention started really being drawn to it. In February 14th, 1981, Tom Dombrowski was sent by his mom to go check out who these men in suits were that were checking out the town. Now, these people that were checking the town were Pennsylvania state officials that had come to see what was actually happening in Centralia, so they could essentially get behind the funding, or get behind actually pushing this legislation to help fund. While en route to go see who these men were, Todd saw smoke coming out of the ground by a tree, so he went over to investigate it, and the earth underneath him collapsed. So he starts falling into this hole that was going down to where a mine tunnel was at. Luckily for him, with his quick reaction, he was able to grab onto a tree root and hold on and start screaming for help. Even more lucky for him, his cousin was nearby, who was able to reach down and pull him out, because he was wearing this bright orange hat, so it was not hard to miss. Pulled him out of the pit. They instantly went to, I think their grandmother, or to an adult, and told him what had happened. What's this small of a town, the word got around super quickly to what was happening, and the state officials were now pretty much, they had that final nail in the coffin to know that their action had to be taken at a federal level. Like, more eyes needed to be on this. Had Todd not been pulled out, he could have died one of three ways. One, he could have fallen all the way down to the bottom of that pit and burned to death, because temperatures at the bottom of the pit were ranging from 400 to 500 degrees. Could have died from asphyxiation from carbon monoxide. As I just keep saying, carbon monoxide is everywhere with this fire. Or he could have, when the ground was collapsing, he could have suffocated from the earth collapsing in around him. When they pulled him out of the pit, he was apparently coated. He wasn't even coated in mud. He was like caked in dirt because the temperature of the pit was so hot that any mud that hit him started cooking onto him. John Coddington was the owner of the gas station in town, and we have two stories about him. The first one was pretty scary in itself. He owned the gas station in town, and he started noticing that he was having large losses on his gas that was from his station. When he noticed that it was actually flowing out of the the overflow line, he realized that what was happening was the ground temperature was rising so much that the gas was expanding and then flowing out of the tank. When they started taking temperatures of it right before they actually pumped the entire thing out, it was 130 degrees, which is very frightening because it would not take much for that gas to ignite. So they had the entire gas tanks pumped out. Gas station was condemned, could no longer have gas there. They filled all the tanks with water to stop explosions. So that's already pretty heartbreaking in itself to have your business be completely taken under because of the fact that, these fires are affecting you. However, on March 19th, 1981, John Coddington was found in his home unresponsive. He was rushed to the hospital, and it turned out that the amount of carbon monoxide dissolved in his blood was extremely high, meaning he would have died from carbon monoxide asphyxiation had nobody found him. By the end of 1981, 29 families had been declared eligible for relocation. So that now we're starting to get to the point where people are moving. In 1983, neighboring town Burnsville was threatened by these fires expanding, as well as the Route 61, like I mentioned earlier, that followed the original Reading Road. Those were both being affected by the mine fires. On July 12, 1983, the mine fire had affected at least 195 acres of land and would cost $660 million and destroy a significant amount of homes. And that was $660 million in 1983. And as of 2022, that would be $1.85 billion to completely get rid of this fire. Estimated. And we all know how government estimations are. They are always way beneath what is true. On August 11th, the town voted to relocate with almost a unanimous yes. That same year, 1983, $42 million had been allocated from the federal government to start help relocating residents. As the people were moved out of their homes and they were relocated to a new place, their houses were condemned and then demolished, all the trash removed, and then the homes filled in so that no one could live there ever again. By the end of 1968, there were less than 50 homes left standing in Centralia. The people that remained in Centralia at this point felt extremely betrayed by the people that had left. They felt that they had abandoned their hometown, that they had given in to the government essentially shooing them out, and now it's pretty much, if you just start chipping away at the pile, eventually it's just one stick. So they felt that they were standing alone. So it's only a matter of time before my neighbor starts moving out too, and now I'm down to 49 homes. And then that neighbor next to me on the other side is gone 48 homes, and it's slowly but slowly there's all pieces left. I was watching one of the documentaries on it, and it was saying about how they specifically targeted people that lived in the middle of the block. So they would get them to move out, and then they would tear down their row homes. So you just have a giant gap in the middle of the homes. So that people wouldn't want to look at that anymore. They want to live next to that. And they figured, well, might as well take the money and move out. And then slowly, one by one, start breaking down the blocks and getting people out of the town. Of the 50 homes that remained, anybody that was renting property in there were offered no money at all because they didn't own property. So they were forced to evict without having any kind of financial compensation. At this point, voluntary relocation was becoming mandatory eviction. By the end of the 80s, the gases, the heat, the steam, the fire, the smoke coming out of the ground was no longer just a one-off thing. It was almost standard at this point. The amount of smoke that was billowing across Route 61 was a hazard to drivers going across, on top of the fact that it was causing the road to buckle and bend and crack, and subsidence was occurring left and right, so now drivers weren't even safe to go across it. In the early 1990s, Route 61, south of Centralia, that historic Reading Road, was no longer safe to drive on. It was condemned, and they had to reroute the whole thing. It is now today referred to as Graffiti Highway. A lot of the pictures you'll see of what remains of Centralia, one of the big landmarks per se, is this broken highway with graffiti all over it. In 1992, Governor Casey declared eminent domain over Centralia and all the remaining residents in the town. What eminent domain means is that the government is now forcibly evicting and relocating the residents of that area for the safety of the people in the area. Now, you're probably saying, well, didn't forcible relocation be declared before? It just keeps happening. They keep saying you have to move, and the people just keep digging their heels in, and they will keep getting lawyers because they're determining that their livelihood is being ruined. Pennsylvania at this point now, since eminent domain, one of the big things is that the state now owns all the properties. They declare that these are our properties, so it is their property to evict you from. Helen Wormer, who has been a vocal voice in the entire fight against the federal government on their relocation and their actions they should be taking, was vocal about this whole thing from the very start, and she remained. By 1995, the remaining residents filed a lawsuit to stop the eviction. Though the evictions were still upheld, they didn't essentially rescind them. Governor Ridge, who new governor at this point, wanted nothing to do with this mess, so the evictions were suspended. So instead of deleting the evictions, he just ignored them for the time being. One of the big things to not owning the deed to your own home, and in this whole eminent domain, is so the federal government owns your home, so you don't have to pay property tax now. So, I mean, silver lining. As of 2000, there was only 21 people remaining in the city that had not been evicted or had moved out on their own volition or died, because there was a lot of old people that were still living there. In 2002, USPS officially revoked the town zip code, which is 17927. In 2013, the remaining 8 residents won their lawsuit and were permitted to stay on the land in Centralia until their death, at which point their house would be demolished and would be turned over. The land would be turned over to the state. So there is no willing your property to your descendants. It just, once you die, your property inside the house can move down, but the property itself will not be willed to your heirs. As of 2022, there are now only 5 remaining residents of Centralia, according to the U.S. Census website. To follow up on all these mine fire theories, so we already discussed that the popular, essentially accepted theory is that the mine fire was started by trash that was burned in the open pit, which had gone down essentially to an unclosed mine tunnel or vein of coal and ignited the fire and kept going. There are 2 other ones actually that exist beyond there. Accidental trash fire theory states that the fire actually started the day prior to the controlled burn where they dumped hot coals in there. The only problem with that is that if this fire had started and then went down, people would have noticed a fire coming from this open pit a day before. Though it's possible that the coals essentially burned holes and embers all the way down to a coal vein, started the fire down there, and the smoke didn't really billow its way out. It kind of got filtered by the trash. Still less likely. The other theory is that this fire was not a new fire. This fire was a pre-existing fire that had just continued from before. So the old mine fire rekindled is what I call it. Mine fires were not an uncommon occurrence. Accidents always happen whenever you're working, especially with combustible materials or any kind of closed space. So all these other mine fires that existed, they were controlled or closed off so that there were no issues. Well, it's possible, because these mines have been abandoned for decades, just essentially breached out from where they were contained at and then got to the larger area. I got some random facts at this point. I didn't know where else to put them, but I figured that they were some kind of worth noting or stuff I found interesting while I was doing my research. And yet again, I feel like this whole time I've done my best to not make any jokes, and even after this I saw my closing remarks. So we're going to call these fun facts. So a time capsule from the town was opened in May 2014, which was actually 2 years earlier than when it was projected to be open, because it was buried in it was buried in 1966, so it would have been 50 years after, so somebody opened it up 48, for shame. The capsule, however, had been sitting in water, so a lot of the stuff inside got some water damage, but inside there was a miner's helmet, a miner's lamp, some coal, a Bible, local souvenirs of the area, and strangely enough, a pair of bloomers signed by all the men of Centralia in 1966. The movie Silent Hill, based on the video game, was actually inspired a lot by the ambiance and just the ghost town aesthetic of Centralia itself. The highest recorded temperature of the mine fire was 1,350 degrees Fahrenheit. And I don't know what it is in Celsius, but we'll just, we'll put it right here for right now because post-production is always fun for me. There is a conspiracy with regards to why the fire lasted as long as it did. The conspiracy pretty much around the fact that the federal government didn't do anything, the federal and the state didn't do their best to their abilities because of the fact that they wanted Centralia to continue to burn and evict all these people out. Because the mine fires that they were, that was being affected at the time were in kind of the minor parts of the caves and the mines and whatnot. Underneath the town, there was what they refer to as the Mammoth Anthracite vein, which was about 25 feet thick. And that's a lot of anthracite. And the town had then become put in eminent domain, so now the federal government owns it now. They now own mineral rights to it. But since, as we discussed, the borough was not dissolved because they won their lawsuit against the federal government, so they didn't have to be evicted. So there were enough people to technically have a borough council. So 5 people is the minimum for a borough council. So these last 5 residents are the only ones holding it down. So as soon as one of them goes, the borough council is dissolved and the federal government now owns the Mammoth Anthracite vein. Alright, so these are my closing thoughts. So as I said in the beginning, I came into this research thinking that this would be a topic that I could poke and joke about, that I could, make an interesting little tell-all and make you kind of have a laugh with me. However, the more I learned about it, the more of a tragic tale it is. The more I watched documentaries, not just reading about it, but I watched a couple documentaries on it to actually hear from the victims of this and hear how they felt. So Centralia, to them, like all the people that lived there, this town wasn't just some town. This town was their home. We're talking multi-generation. People had grown up after their grandparents had grown up in this town. So they didn't want to just give that away. People's houses had been handed down to them from their parents and their grandparents. So just to tell somebody hey, get out because, somebody burned some trash in an accident. So the government didn't do anything about it. Just get out of the town. It was very hard for people to understand. Their town wasn't just a town. It was a community to them. We're talking friendships were being made and now they're being torn apart. A lot of people were kind of in denial for a while about the severity of the issue. Even with smoke and steam coming out of the ground, it would be coming out across town. So there's no way it's going to affect my house. A lot of people didn't want to move because they didn't really feel that they were threatened, but until it was too late, and then your house would be flooded with carbon monoxide, or essentially the property value of your house was essentially nothing. So then when you wanted to leave, when you had to leave, you got nothing for your house. A lot of the issues came from the fact that this was in the 60s, pushing all the way still into the 90s. This is the age before the internet, and we have the privilege of, as soon as someone makes a mistake, the other side of the world hears about it in less than a minute. There were people in the 80s that still had no clue what Centralia was. There were people in government that probably didn't know or didn't care because they hear, oh, it's just some town in the middle of the Pennsylvania wilderness. Who gives a shit? There's no point in us handling this situation. So they kept getting backburner. They kept getting left behind, and that's why this issue compounded itself. It kept getting worse because it wasn't being taken seriously enough. There are people that theorize that this could have been handled for about $1,000, this whole issue. The fire could have been put out. But because funding constantly ran out, but because people never took this seriously enough, they thought that, I guess they hoped that it would just put itself out, or that the people would just move out on their own. It just kept getting worse and worse and worse. With all these government officials coming into town, they would come in, they would take an assessment, and they would leave, and they would give chump change to fix it and say, hey, go fix it yourself. So a lot of people learned not to rely on the government for help at that point. So when the government came in and said, hey, you need to move out of your house, here's money to do it, we're giving you basically nothing, these people were like, I'm not going to listen to you. We've been listening to you for so long, and you have not given us any worthwhile information or help. So why would we trust you now? And that's where I'm wrapping up at the end. When I said earlier, there is a common trend that is the heartbreak story of this whole thing, and why to me it is so just upsetting, and why I had a change of heart as I learned more about this, is that the government did not take this seriously. The federal government, the state government, did not take this as seriously as they should have. The people in the town, they knew what was wrong. They told them what to do, and the state feds are just like, here's $20, go buy yourself a candy bar. Time and time again, were just ignored, and so they learned that they could not trust their appointed officials. So that at the end of the day, they ended up with nothing. And to think that this is just a one-off thing, just put yourself in their shoes for a second. Imagine, so my hometown where I grew up is not as isolated as Centralia is, but it's still like one of those things where if something happened in that town, you would have to essentially up and move. I wouldn't have a hometown to call anymore. These people don't have that anymore. They don't have the ability to bring their children, their grandchildren, to the elementary school that they went to go see a movie at the movie theater that they used to. Stuff like that. Like, they don't have that heritage anymore that they used to, and now it's all gone. The town itself, there's the before and after pictures. It's mind blowing that there was once a town there, and now it's just a couple crossroads. So I highly recommend looking into these in your free time if you didn't get enough of me talking about it. There are a couple documentaries. I'll link them in the description. There'll be some links in the description for information for you can find. There's a great website, centraliapa.org. And hopefully in the next topic, I already have a topic in mind, but I'm hoping that the people I've contacted get back to me soon. But hopefully the next one is a lot more lighthearted, and I hope that you guys found this topic as interesting as I did. If you did, please give me a like, give me a subscribe, give me a comment, things that you would like to see me do in the future. Hey, guess what? I got a ring light now. So now I can do things like, ooh, and then I can turn it all the way down, and then all the way up. Or I can give you guys my shitty lighting as before, and then you can have this like kind of like slow laggy camera. But yeah, that's all I got to say today. I really appreciate you sticking with me, and hopefully get back there. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one. Later.